Hello everyone, I'm Yograni, Assistant Professor, Department of English, KCS Kasinarar College of Arts and Science, Chennai. Today, the video is about the play Trifles, written by Susan Glaspell. Susan Glaspell was an American playwright, novelist, journalist, and actress. She was born in 1876. She was the founder of the Provincetown Players, along with her husband George Cram Cook. It was the first modern American theatre company. Her famous works are Allison's House, Trifles. She won Pulitzer Prize for Drama in 1931. She died in 1948. A brief introduction to the play Trifles. Trifles is a one-act play by Susan Glaspell. It is a story of murder mystery. It was first performed by the Provincetown Players at the Wharf Theatre in Provincetown, Massachusetts. It was staged on August 8, 1916. The story is based on the murder of 60-year-old John Hossack when Susan Glaspell was a journalist in Des Moines Daily News. John Hossack's wife, Margaret, was arrested for murdering her husband with an axe. Glaspell's visit to Hossack's farmhouse changed her perspective of finding fault with Margaret. The visit became the basis to write the play Trifles. Glaspell later turned the play Trifles into a short story, retitling it as A Jury of Her Peers. The characters in the play are George Henderson, the county attorney, Henry Peters, the sheriff, Mrs. Peters, sheriff's wife, Louis Hale, a neighboring farmer, Mrs. Hale, his wife, John Wright, the farmer who is murdered, Mrs. Minnie Wright, his wife. The play is set in John Wright's abandoned farmhouse. It is a lonesome, gloomy place down in the hollow where the road cannot be seen. The story's motive is to reveal the murderer of John Wright. The characters doubt whether the murder must be committed by his wife or someone else. The male characters suspect Mrs. Wright, so they focus to search for evidence in the kitchen. The story begins in the farmhouse of John Wright. The kitchen appears to be messy. The county attorney, sheriff, and Mr. Hale enter the house. They are followed by Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peter. The women stand at the door. They do not join the men near the fire to warm them. Mr. Henderson makes sure that nothing is touched in the house. He begins to investigate Mr. Hale by asking him the events of the previous day. Mr. Hale is the person who initially learns the death of Mr. Wright. He tells Mr. Henderson that he visited Mr. Wright's house to ask about getting a telephone line for him. Mrs. Wright was sitting in a rocker, moving back and forth. She had an apron in her hand and was nervously pleating it. He found her to behave strangely. She said that her husband is dead upstairs with a rope around his neck. She confessed that someone strangled her husband when she was fast asleep. Mr. Hale brings Sheriff Henry Peters to help him to see Mr. Wright dead upstairs. After confirming Mr. Wright's death, Henry goes out to bring the coroner, George Henderson. In the meanwhile, Mr. Hale tells about his purpose of visit to Mrs. Wright. When she heard about the telephone, she starts to laugh. Then she looks scared. It is because Mr. Wright does not prefer to have a telephone as people chat a lot. He wishes to be quiet and peaceful. Mr. George Henderson begins his investigation in the kitchen. He finds a glass jar of fruit preservative to be broken because of cold. It has made the cupboard closet messy. Mrs. Peters interrupts him, saying that Mrs. Wright was worried about her preserves. Mr. Peters and Mr. Henderson comment sarcastically that she is held for murder and worries about the preservative. Mr. Hale says that women worry over the trifles. Hearing the men, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale move closer to each other. Mr. Henderson criticizes Mrs. Wright for the dirty towels in the kitchen. He kicks the pan under the sink. He says that Mrs. Wright has poor housekeeping skills. However, Mrs. Hale disapproves him, saying that the towels get dirty quickly. She adds that men's hands are not clean as always. Mrs. Hale regrets for not visiting Mrs. Wright for more than a year. She, being a farmer's wife, had always been busy in her farm. Moreover, the place itself is gloomy, and Mr. Wright in the house makes the place less cheerful. Mr. Henderson ignores her words, saying that he'll talk about Mr. Wright little later. The men go upstairs in search of evidence. Mr. Henderson allows Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters to gather few belongings for Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Hale arranges the pan in the kitchen, disturbed by Mr. Henderson. She does not like men entering into the kitchen and criticizing. They go to the front room to take clothes and a pair of socks for Mrs. Wright from her closet. Mrs. Hale shares her knowledge about Mrs. Wright. She examines Mrs. Wright's skirt. She remembers her as Minnie Foster before 30 years. She was very happy then, wearing pretty clothes. She used to sing beautifully, but she was not cheerful after her marriage. Mr. Wright was very strict. He did not even allow her to join the Ladies' Aid, which helps the women. She has now asked only for her apron from the top drawer in the cupboard and a shawl which always hangs behind the door. Mrs. Hale considers her as an innocent woman worried about fruit preservative. Mrs. Peters says that her husband felt that things may not turn good for Mrs. Wright. Mr. Henderson suspects how a wife could not wake up during a murder. Mrs. Hale too mentions that her husband found a gun in the house. It is suspicious to use a rope to murder instead of the gun. She is worried about Mrs. Wright, who is locked in the town while they investigate in her house. Mrs. Peters finds a large sewing basket. It has bright pieces to make a quilt. She was following log cabin pattern in which the fabric is pieced around a center square. Mrs. Hale wonders if she was going to quilt it or just knot it. The men go to the barn in search of evidence. They laugh listening to women's discussion about the blanket to be quilted or knotted. They dismiss their conversation as trifle, that is, something unimportant. Mrs. Hale observes strange things. In the kitchen, half of the dish towel is clean. She finds a loaf of bread outside the bread box. She then notices that the quilt is unfinished. One block of the quilt is made untidily than the other stitches, which were even and neatly done. It reveals her nervousness. She wonders what she was nervous about. Mrs. Hale tries to redo the stitch properly before the men come into the house. Mrs. Peters searches for the paper and string in the cupboard to complete the quilt, but instead she finds a bird cage. There was no bird in it. Mrs. Hale remembers a man who sold canary. Maybe a cat had got it, but Mrs. Wright did not have a cat. She was upset when Mrs. Peters' cat went into her room. The door of the cage was also broken. Mrs. Hale worries for not visiting Mrs. Wright all these days. She knows Mr. Wright was a hard man. They do not have children, so the house must be quiet. Mr. Wright goes out for work all day. He was not a good company even when he was at home, so Mrs. Wright must have had the canary as a companion. Mrs. Hale says about Mrs. Wright, "She was kind of like a bird herself, real sweet and pretty. but kind of timid and fluttery. But she has changed after her marriage. Now, listen to the cheerful voice of the canary. Now, the question is that where is the canary gone? What happened to it? Does this have anything to do with the murder? Let us break the suspense in the next video. As always, thanks for listening and thanks for your time. Thank you.